Somewhere beneath museum glass, a clay tablet no larger than your hand holds the weight of 250,000 years. Its surface is cracked not from age alone, but from the pressure of what it carries. Run your fingers across the air above it, and you can almost feel the wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet earth by someone who believed they were recording not myth, but memory. The dust of 40 centuries clings to those grooves. And in the silence of that display case, if you listen past the hum of climate control and the shuffle of passing tourists, you'll hear something older. A rhythm, faint, patient, like a heartbeat buried beneath stone. Something brought you to this moment, not an algorithm, not restlessness, but a pulse that has been travelling through ash and shadow for thousands of years, waiting for someone willing to listen. The same pulse that guided a scribe's hand in ancient Sumer as he pressed into clay a single, impossible claim that 8 kings once ruled the earth for 241,200 years, and then the flood swept everything away. What if civilization is not a straight line from primitive to advanced? What if it is a circle rising, flourishing, drowning, and rising again, and we are simply living in the latest turn, mistaking the middle of the story for its beginning? This tablet does not offer comfortable answers. It offers something more dangerous, a chronology that refuses to fit inside our timeline. Cities we can dig up, flood layers we can touch, numbers encoded in the mathematics of stars, and a silence between the lines so heavy it feels like something vast has been taken from the record of the world. They never claimed to invent civilization. They claimed to restore it. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. Close your eyes. Not because I ask, but because the place we're going is easier to reach in darkness. Imagine the southern plains of Iraq at the edge of night. Not the Iraq of headlines and burning oil fields, but something older. Something the land remembers in its bones. A flatness so absolute it feels like the earth gave up trying to become anything else, and simply surrendered to the horizontal. The sky here doesn't arch overhead, it presses down a weight of indigo and scattered dust resting on the horizon like a hand laid gently on the brow of a sleeping child. There is no hill to interrupt it, no tree tall enough to argue with the wind, just the plain stretching in every direction, and above it the slow wheeling of stars so bright they seem wet as though the darkness itself is sweating light. This is Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. But right now there are no rivers in sight, only the memory of them dry channels carved into the silt, like old scars on skin that has forgotten how to bleed. The Tigris and Euphrates once braided through this region in thick, muscular currents, depositing layers of fertile mud with each seasonal flood. Millennia of that rhythm built the ground beneath your feet. Every grain of dust you're standing on was once river water's gift carried from the mountains of eastern Turkey, from snowmelt and highland rain dragged south across hundreds of kilometres and laid down here particle by particle in the patient arithmetic of sediment. Erosion is time thinking, and the earth beneath southern Iraq has been thinking for a very long time. Feel the temperature. It's the hour after sunset and the heat of the day hasn't fully released its grip. The ground still radiates warmth, the dry mineral heat that rises through the soles of your feet and settles somewhere behind your ribs. The air smells of dust and distance, not unpleasant but ancient. The kind of smell that clings to old libraries and unopened tombs, the scent of matter that has been sitting still for so long it has forgotten what movement feels like. If patience had a smell, it would be this baked clay and time, and if you stood here long enough perfectly still, you might begin to feel yourself becoming part of the sediment too, another layer in the slow accumulation of everything this landscape has witnessed and absorbed and refused to release. Now look down. Beneath the surface of this plain, beneath the scrub grass and the cracked topsoil, the earth holds its archives. Layer upon layer of compressed existence, each stratum a chapter, each band of colour, a sentence in a story that spans not centuries but millennia. Pale, silt, dark ash, reddish clay, bleached sand. The deeper you go, the older the sentence, and if you could peel the ground apart the way you peel pages from a waterlogged book, gently, reverently knowing that each page might be the last to survive, you would find that the earth has been keeping records far longer than any scribe. 3 meters down, you might find the foundation of a Babylonian granary. 5 meters down, fragments of Akkadian pottery still carrying geometric patterns someone once found beautiful enough to repeat. 8 meters down, the remains of an early Sumerian dwelling, a hearth, a grinding stone, a child's clay figurine missing its head. 12 meters down, you enter a silence. No pottery, no tools, no architecture. Just a thick band of sterile silt water, deposited clay, fine as flour, containing nothing human at all. This is the flood layer, the geological signature of catastrophe. A blank page in the Earth's manuscript where the story simply stops, as if the narrator paused mid-sentence, walked away, and didn't return for centuries. Below that silence, if you keep digging the story, resumes, but it's a different story now. Different pottery styles, different building techniques, a different world separated from the one above by a wall of water-borne clay that reads in the language of geology like a held breath. Something happened here. Something large enough to interrupt the continuity of human presence in this landscape. Something the Earth recorded even though no one was left to write it down. This is where we are tonight. Not in the museum, not yet. We're here in the field, in the dirt, in the silence between layers. The stars overhead are the same ones. Sumerian astronomers tracked with obsessive precision 5,000 years ago, charting the movements of Venus and Jupiter against the slow wheel of the zodiac. The same constellations, the same mathematical relationships, only the names have changed. They called Venus Inanna. They measured the sky in units of 60. And they believed with the quiet certainty of people who had watched the heavens long enough to notice patterns, within patterns that the stars were not decoration. They were memory. The night deepens and the temperature drops slowly the way grief settles. Not all at once, but in increments you barely notice until you realize you're shivering. The wind picks up, carrying fine grains of sand across the surface of the plain, rearranging the dust in patterns that will be different by morning. Time works the same way. It carries things, beliefs, languages, mathematical systems, the memory of floods, and deposits them in new places, in new forms, often so changed by the journey that we don't recognize them as the same material. But the composition is identical. The grain is the same, only the arrangement has shifted. Somewhere beneath this plain a clay tablet rests in the darkness. It has known for 4,000 years, its surface holding the impressions of a reed stylus, pushed into wet earth by a scribe who believed he was preserving something essential, not inventing, not imagining, transcribing, copying from an older source, maintaining a chain of transmission that stretched back in his understanding to before the flood, before the silence in the earth, before the blank page that divided one world from the next. Gravity is memory. It pulls everything downward toward the center, toward the oldest layers. And tonight that's where we're going, down through the strata, down through the dust and the ash, and the sterile flood, silt down past the reach of written history into the silence where only the earth keeps records. The atmosphere here is not empty. It's full of the accumulated weight of everything that has been forgotten and everything that refuses to be. The air tastes of mineral patience. The darkness feels textured, layered, as though the night itself has strata. And if you could excavate it the way you excavate a tell, you would find older nights beneath this one. Nights when different stars occupied different positions, nights when the coastline was 100 kilometers south of where it is now, nights when the rivers ran wider, and the plain was green, and the temples of Eridu gleamed with fresh whitewash under a moon that looked exactly as it looks tonight. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. The land remembers both truths simultaneously. Breathe. Let the stillness settle around you like sediment settling through water. The next layer is waiting. The evidence does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives like sediment, grain by grain, layer by layer, so slowly that you don't notice the accumulation, until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath your feet is made entirely of things that fell. This is how science works when it encounters the ancient world. Not with sudden illumination, but with the patient gathering of fragments, each one too small to mean anything alone, each one indispensable to the shape that eventually emerges. And the shape emerging from the dust of southern Mesopotamia is stranger than anyone expected when the first shovels broke ground in the late 19th century. It began with the tablets themselves. When European archaeologists descended on the mounds of southern Iraq in the 1840s and 1850s, they were looking for the Bible. They wanted confirmation, physical, tangible, holdable confirmation that the stories of Genesis had roots in historical soil. What they found instead was something far more complicated. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets emerged from the earth at sites like Nineveh, Nippur Kish, and Lagash, stacked in the ruins of ancient libraries and temple archives like fossilized memory waiting to be read. Most were administrative grain inventories, tax records, property transactions, the bureaucratic machinery of civilizations that had been dust for 2,000 years. But among these mundane documents scattered like anomalies in an otherwise orderly dataset were texts that didn't fit any expected category. Hymns to gods whose names had been forgotten. Mathematical tables using a number system based on 60 instead of 10. Astronomical observations recording the movements of planets with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 3 millennia. And one text in particular that would haunt scholarship for the next century and a half, a king list. The Sumerian King List was not discovered all at once. It was reconstructed from multiple fragments found at different sites across Mesopotamia, each fragment preserving a portion of the same chronological tradition. The earliest known version dates to approximately 2100 BC during the Third Dynasty of Ur, but the text itself claims to describe events stretching back hundreds of thousands of years before that date. When scholars first assembled these fragments into a coherent sequence, they found themselves reading a document that behaved like a historical record in every formal respect. Cities named in geographical order, rulers listed in dynastic succession, reign lengths noted with numerical precision, but contained numbers so enormous they seemed to belong to a different category of thought entirely. 8 kings before the flood ruling across 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. The numbers were pressed into clay with the same careful wedge-shaped marks, used for everything else, no distinction in style or format between these cosmic figures and the perfectly ordinary reign lengths that appeared later in the same text. This is what makes the king list so difficult to dismiss. It doesn't read like mythology. There's no narrative arc, no moral lesson, no dramatic tension. It reads like a ledger, the same kind of administrative document that Mesopotamian scribes produced by the thousands for tracking grain shipments and temple expenditures. The format is identical, only the numbers are impossible. And the scholars who first encountered this paradox did what scholars have always done with things that don't fit, they explained it away. The pre-flood section was propaganda, they said, a literary device designed to give later dynasties an aura of cosmic legitimacy by connecting them to impossibly ancient predecessors. The numbers were symbolic, inflated for rhetorical effect, never meant to be taken as literal chronology. This explanation was tidy. It was reasonable. And it held for decades until the archaeologists started digging beneath the historical layers and found something that the explanation couldn't account for. At Ur in 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley's team excavated through occupational layer after occupational layer, pottery tools, architecture, the familiar debris of human habitation, until they hit a stratum that contained nothing at all. 8 feet of clean water-deposited silt. No artifacts, no ash, no building foundations. Just the geological signature of massive flooding, a blank interruption in the human record so dramatic that Woolley immediately telegraphed his conclusion back to London. He had found evidence of the biblical flood. Whether or not that specific claim was justified, what he had undeniably found was a physical correlate for the King List's most striking structural feature, its sharp division between 2 eras separated by catastrophe. The same pattern appeared at Kish, where 5 feet of flood silt separated earlier occupation from later rebuilding. At Shuruppak, the last pre-flood city named in the King List, the break was even more dramatic. A thick band of riverine clay deposited by violent inundation, clearly distinguishing older settlement layers from everything that came after. Not every site flooded at the same time or to the same degree, and Mesopotamia's river valleys experienced multiple catastrophic floods across millennia, but the pattern was consistent enough to be significant. Major cities showed geological evidence of severe disruption that correlated with breaks in cultural continuity, and those breaks mirrored the King List's narrative structure, with unsettling precision. Then there were the cities themselves. The 5 pre-flood cities named in the King List, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, were not mythological inventions. They were real places, and when archaeologists excavated them, they found occupation layers extending back far beyond the earliest written records deep into the pre-literate past. Eridu's temple mound revealed 18 successive shrines, built one atop another over a span of nearly 8,000 years, the deepest levels predating Sumerian civilization by millennia. Shurupak's pre-flood layers showed evidence of urban planning, specialized labor, and long-distance trade networks, the hallmarks of complex society existing in the very location and the very era the King List identified as the seat of kingship before the waters came. The text remembered these cities correctly as ancient as foundational, as centers of something significant that predated the written record by thousands of years. And then there was the mathematics. The pre-flood reign length 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years looked random. At first glance, absurdly large numbers chosen to convey a vague sense of antiquity. But when researchers examined them through the lens of Sumerian base, 60 arithmetic, a pattern emerged that randomness could not explain. 28,800 equals exactly 8 times 3,600. 36,000 equals 10 times 3,600. 43,200 equals 12 times 3,600. The number 3,600, called a sar in Sumerian, was a fundamental unit in their astronomical calculations used to measure celestial cycles too vast for ordinary human years. The pre-flood reigns weren't arbitrary. They were precise multiples of an astronomical constant, encoded in the mathematical language of people who tracked Venus cycles and calculated the precession of the equinoxes. The evidence accumulates, grain by grain, layer by layer, and the shape it forms is not the shape we expected. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops cooperating with the explanation. Not dramatically, not with a single, devastating contradiction that collapses the entire framework at once, but quietly the way a crack appears in a wall long before the wall falls. You notice it only if you're paying close enough attention, and even then you might convince yourself it's nothing, a trick of the light, an artifact of measurement error, a minor inconsistency that will resolve itself once more data arrives. But it doesn't resolve, it widens. And eventually you have to admit that the crack isn't in your evidence. It's in the story you've been telling about your evidence. The Sumerian King List has several of these cracks, and the longer you look at them, the harder they become to paper over with conventional explanations. The first anomaly is the one that hides in plain sight the flood itself. If the pre-flood section of the King List is pure mythology invented by later scribes to glorify their dynasties with an aura of cosmic antiquity, then the flood should function as a dramatic set piece, a narrative climax designed to impress and inspire. But it doesn't. The text allocates exactly one line to the most catastrophic event in its entire chronology. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No description of rising waters, no desperate survivors clinging to wreckage, no divine anger or moral judgment, no explanation whatsoever for why the flood came or what it destroyed. The scribe who wrote this line treated the flood the way a modern accountant might treat a fiscal year boundary, as a structural delimiter requiring no elaboration, because everyone already understood what it meant. This is not how mythology works. Mythology dramatizes, embellishes, assigns meaning. The King List's treatment of the flood is the opposite. It assumes shared knowledge so complete that a single line suffices. And that assumption, that the audience already knew what the flood was and what it had done, suggests something far more interesting than invention. It suggests memory. The second anomaly lives in the numbers. We've already noted that the pre-flood reign lengths are precise multiples of the Sar, the Sumerian astronomical unit, equal to 3,600. But there's something stranger buried in that precision, something that becomes visible only when you compare the King List's mathematics to other ancient chronological systems separated from Mesopotamia by thousands of miles and centuries of independent development. The Hindu concept of yugas divides cosmic time into 4 descending ages: Satya Yuga lasting 1,728,000 years, Treta Yuga lasting 1,296,000 years, Dvapara Yuga lasting 864,000 years, and Kali Yuga lasting 432,000 years. These numbers are all multiples of 432,000, and 432,000 is itself 120, multiplied by 3,620 Sa. The same base, 60 mathematical architecture that structures the Sumerian King List appears in a completely different cultural tradition, on a completely different continent encoding cosmic time in the same fundamental units. This is the kind of coincidence that stops being coincidental once you notice it, the way finding the same fingerprint at 2 unrelated crime scenes changes the nature of the investigation entirely. The third anomaly is civilizational. The Sumerians appeared in the archaeological record around 3500 BC, with a cultural package so sophisticated it has no visible developmental arc. Fully formed writing capable of expressing abstract thought, base 60 mathematics, flexible enough to perform complex astronomical calculations, urban planning organised around monumental temple architecture, astronomical knowledge tracking planetary movements with precision that wouldn't be replicated in Europe until the Renaissance. Every other early civilization shows a gradual build-up. Experimental phases, transitional forms, false starts, the messy evidence of people figuring things out as they go. Egypt's hieroglyphs evolved over centuries from simple pictograms to phonetic sophistication. Chinese writing shows a long developmental trajectory from oracle bones to standardized characters. Mesoamerican scripts have visible stages of increasing complexity. Sumerian cuneiform follows none of these patterns. It arrives nearly complete standardized across multiple sites simultaneously, as though the system was already established before the first tablet was pressed. The language itself, Sumerian, is equally anomalous, a linguistic orphan with no known relatives, no parent family, no cognates linking it to any other tongue on earth. It appears in the earliest texts as a fully mature language with complex grammar and extensive vocabulary, and then it stands alone connected to nothing, as if it walked out of a door that closed behind it and left no hallway visible on the other side. The fourth anomaly is architectural, and it whispers from the deepest layers of the oldest sites. At Eridu, the city the King List names as the first seat of kingship, archaeologists found 18 successive temple structures built one atop another on the same sacred mound over a span of nearly 8,000 years. The deepest levels predate Sumerian civilization by millennia, yet they already show careful alignment, ritual offering platforms and evidence of organized religious practice maintained across generations. Whatever made that spot sacred was sacred before the Sumerians existed as a recognizable culture, and it remained sacred long enough to anchor continuous temple construction for 8,000 years. That kind of persistence doesn't happen by accident. It happens because something, some event, some knowledge, some experience was considered so important that every generation felt compelled to mark the same ground rebuild on the same foundation, maintain connection to the same origin point, regardless of how much the world changed around them. The temples at Eridu aren't just architecture, they're memory encoded in mud brick, a physical insistence that this place matters, that something began here, that the thread must not be broken. And then there is the anomaly that contains all the others, the fundamental strangeness of the King List structure itself. If the pre-flood section is propaganda designed to legitimize later rulers, it is spectacularly bad propaganda. Effective political mythology claims unbroken continuity with a glorious past. It doesn't insert a catastrophic discontinuity that severs that connection and forces the cosmic order to restart from scratch. If a scribe wanted to make his king seem divinely ordained, he would claim descent from an uninterrupted line of divine rulers stretching back to the beginning of time. He would not create a document that says the divine order was shattered by a flood, that everything was lost, that kingship had to descend from heaven a second time, because the first descent failed to survive. The inclusion of the flood as a hard structural break, a reset, that divides cosmic time from human time, astronomical epochs from political dynasties, makes no sense as invention. It makes perfect sense as memory. Someone remembering a genuine discontinuity, a real rupture in cultural transmission, and encoding it honestly, even though it complicated the narrative they were trying to preserve. The anomalies accumulate the way hairline fractures accumulate in stressed stone, individually ignorable, collectively devastating. The flood treated as common knowledge rather than narrative spectacle. The mathematical precision linking Mesopotamian and Hindu cosmic chronologies across impossible distances. The sudden appearance of a fully formed civilization with no visible developmental history. The architectural persistence of sacred sites across millennia of pre-literate occupation. The self-defeating structure of a propaganda document that honestly records its own civilization's catastrophic interruption. None of these anomalies proves anything by itself. Together they form a pattern, and the pattern says that whatever the King List is preserving, it is not simple fiction. The crack in the wall is widening, and behind it something is breathing. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that once spoke and no longer can. You hear it in abandoned buildings where the architecture still holds the shape of human activity. Doorways scaled for bodies, windows angled for light stairs worn smooth by feet that no longer climb them. The structure remembers use even after the users are gone. That silence is not empty. It is full pressurized heavy with the ghost weight of everything it used to contain. The archaeological record of pre-flood Mesopotamia carries exactly this kind of silence, and the deeper you dig into the cities named by the King List, the louder it becomes. Not louder in volume, louder in implication. Because beneath the earliest written tablets, beneath the first cuneiform signs and administrative records that mark the beginning of what we call history, there are always older layers, deeper strata of human activity extending back thousands of years into an era that left architecture and artifacts, but not a single readable word. And it is in that wordless depth that the King List's most unsettling claims reside. Consider what we find when we excavate below the literate horizon. At Eridu, the pre-literate levels reveal sophisticated temple construction and mud brick shrines with offering platforms, careful astronomical alignment evidence of organized ritual maintained across centuries without interruption. At Shuruppak, pre-flood layers show urban planning, specialized labor divisions and long-distance trade networks, connecting communities across hundreds of kilometers. At sites throughout southern Mesopotamia, the millennia before writing produced pottery of increasing refinement, metallurgical knowledge irrigation systems requiring coordinated labor, and architectural traditions maintained with remarkable consistency across generations. These were not primitive communities stumbling toward complexity. These were organized societies with religious institutions, economic systems, and engineering knowledge sophisticated enough to reshape landscapes. They built, they traded, they worshipped, they planned, and they did all of this without leaving a single sentence we can read, or rather without leaving a single sentence that survived. This is where the silence becomes deafening. Writing requires specific material conditions to endure across millennia. Clay tablets survive because clay once fired or even simply dried in Mesopotamia's arid climate becomes nearly indestructible. But clay tablets represent a particular technological choice, the decision to press meaning into wet earth using a reed stylus. Before that choice was made, or in parallel with it earlier, cultures might have recorded knowledge on materials that time devours without hesitation. Wood rots, leather decays, bark crumbles, woven fibers dissolve. Animal skins, unless specially treated and stored in exceptional conditions, return to organic matter within centuries. If the pre-literate societies of southern Mesopotamia kept records on any of these materials, and it would be strange if cultures sophisticated enough to build temples and manage trade networks kept no records at all. Those records are gone. Not hidden, not waiting to be found, but genuinely destroyed by the chemistry of decomposition and the passage of 6, 7, 8,000 years. We are not looking at cultures that had nothing to say. We are looking at cultures whose words were written on pages that the earth digested. The paradox this creates is profound and uncomfortable. We have physical evidence of cultural sophistication, in the exact cities the King List names as pre-flood centres of kingship. But we have no textual evidence to tell us what those cultures called themselves, how they understood time, what they believed about the cosmos, or how they organised their knowledge. The architectural evidence says complex society. The silence says we cannot know what that society thought. It is like standing in a library after a catastrophic fire. The shelves are intact. The room still holds the shape of a collection. You can see where books once stood from the dust patterns and the spacing of the brackets. But every page is burned and every word is ash. You know the library existed. You know it held knowledge. You cannot read a single line of what it contained, and yet the King List claims to remember. The Sumerian scribes who compiled it around 2100 BC asserted that they knew the sequence of kingship stretching back before writing. Before the flood into ages their own ancestors could barely articulate. They claimed access to a chronological tradition that predated their own civilization by tens of thousands of years, or if we read the numbers as encoded epochs by millennia at minimum. Where did that memory come from if not from written records? The answer may lie in the very architecture that survives when texts do not. Each generation at Eridu rebuilding the temple on the same sacred spot was not merely honouring tradition. They were encoding continuity in the most durable medium available to a pre-literate society. The temple itself became the text. Its placement declared origin. Its persistence declared importance. Its repeated reconstruction declared an unbroken chain of transmission linking the present to something foundational in the deep past. Sacred geography functioned as a mnemonic system, a way of anchoring knowledge to physical locations that could survive the death of languages and the destruction of perishable records. Oral tradition operated alongside this architectural memory, carrying narratives, genealogies, astronomical observations and chronological frameworks across generations, through the disciplined repetition of trained specialists, priests, elders, ritual performers, whose social function was precisely to remember what must not be forgotten. We know from studies of living oral traditions that human memory, when culturally supported and ritually reinforced, can preserve remarkably detailed information across centuries. Aboriginal Australian songlines encode geographical and ecological knowledge spanning thousands of years. West African griots maintain genealogies stretching back dozens of generations with verifiable accuracy. Hindu Vedic traditions preserved complex philosophical and astronomical texts through purely oral transmission for millennia, before they were written down with a fidelity that astonishes modern scholars. The idea that pre-literate Mesopotamian societies could have maintained chronological traditions across the flood boundary and into the early literate period is not fantasy. It is consistent with what we know about human memory, when that memory is treated as sacred obligation rather than casual recollection. But oral tradition, like perishable writing materials, leaves no direct physical trace. It exists only in the minds and voices of its carriers, and when the chain of transmission breaks through catastrophe, displacement, depopulation, or cultural disruption, the knowledge vanishes as completely as words written on bark that rots in wet soil. The flood layers found at Sumerian sites represent exactly the kind of catastrophic disruption that severs oral chains. Communities scattered, populations displaced. The careful social structures that maintained trained rememberers shattered by the same waters that deposited those thick bands of sterile silt. What survived would have been fragmentary pieces of a larger chronology, partial sequences remembered by whoever made it through, reassembled imperfectly by the next generation, from whatever scraps the survivors carried in their heads. The King List in this light begins to look less like a complete record and more like a reconstruction, the best attempt of later scribes, to organise fragmentary inherited memory into coherent chronological form. The silence in the archaeological record is not proof that nothing existed before writing. It is proof that whatever existed was recorded in media that time consumed, leaving only the faintest echo in the traditions of those who came after. And that echo pressed into clay by scribes who understood their role as preservers rather than creators is what we now hold behind museum glass and call the Sumerian King List. A voice carrying the shape of a silence that once held everything. Try to imagine it, not as fantasy, not as speculation dressed in the language of certainty, but as a disciplined act of reconstruction, the way a geologist reads a canyon wall and sees not just rock, but the rivers that carved it, the climates that deposited each layer, the millions of years compressed into coloured bands of stone. We have the layers, we have the flood silt, we have the pre-literate architecture, and the astronomical mathematics and the King List's insistence that there were ages before this one measured in cosmic cycles anchored to real cities ended by catastrophe. So let us carefully and with full acknowledgement of how much we cannot know, try to see what the world might have looked like during the epochs the King List remembers. Not the world of 241,200 literal years ago. That number, as we've discussed, almost certainly encodes something other than elapsed human time, but the world of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the millennia between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, when the Ice Age ended and the modern climate took shape. The forgotten epoch, the age before the flood. The planet you would have seen bore little resemblance to the one we inhabit now. Ice sheets 2 kilometers thick covered much of North America, stretching from the Arctic down to what is now New York and Chicago. Similar glacial masses blanketed Scandinavia, northern Russia, and the highlands of Britain and the Alps. So much of Earth's water was locked in these frozen reservoirs that global sea level sat approximately 120 meters below their current position, a difference so vast it transformed the geography of every continent. Coastlines extended far beyond their present boundaries. The Persian Gulf, that body of water that today separates Iran from Arabia, did not exist. It was dry land, a broad fertile river valley, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, which merged and flowed southward through what is now the Gulf seabed, before emptying into the Indian Ocean at the Strait of Hormuz. People lived there. They had to have lived there. It was prime territory, a river valley, with fertile soil, fresh water, access to marine resources at the distant coastline, exactly the kind of landscape where human cultures have always concentrated and flourished. And every trace of whoever lived there now lies beneath salt water, and centuries of marine sediment as inaccessible as if it had been carried to another planet. The same erasure occurred across the globe. Doggerland, the vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, was a landscape of rivers, forests and wetlands where communities hunted, gathered and left behind stone tools that trawler nets still occasionally pull from the North Sea floor. Sunderland, the enormous continental shelf connecting Southeast Asia's islands into a single landmass nearly the size of Europe, supported what genetic and linguistic evidence suggests was one of the most significant centres of early human cultural development on Earth. The Mediterranean coastline sat kilometres seaward of its present position, and coastal caves that were once inhabited now open their mouths beneath the waves. Everywhere you look, the most desirable real estate for early human settlement, coastal zones, river deltas, confluences of trade routes, sheltered harbours, fertile lowlands, now sits under water, and the archaeological evidence of whoever called those places home went under with them. We are missing the ground floor of human civilization, and we are missing it not because it never existed, but because the ocean rose and swallowed it. During this forgotten epoch before the waters came, the archaeological evidence that does survive on higher ground suggests human capabilities far exceeding what the conventional narrative of steady linear progress would predict. Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, dating to approximately 11,000 years ago, presents T-shaped limestone pillars weighing over 10 tons arranged in precise circles, carved with intricate animal reliefs, and aligned to celestial events, all constructed by people who supposedly had not yet invented agriculture or permanent settlements. The site was not a tentative experiment, it was a confident statement, the work of people who understood engineering astronomical observation, organised labour and symbolic communication at a level that makes no sense if civilization began from scratch in the Neolithic. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Karahan Tepe, Nevala, Chori and other sites across Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent reveal a widespread tradition of megalithic construction, predating everything we thought we knew about when and where complex culture first emerged. These sites cluster in regions that would have been refugia higher ground, where populations displaced by rising seas might have gathered, carrying with them whatever knowledge and traditions they had preserved from the drowning coastlines below. This is the epoch the King List remembers, however imperfectly, however encoded. Not a single golden age of impossible longevity, but a long stretch of human cultural development spanning thousands of years. across landscapes now submerged, during which knowledge-accumulated traditions formed astronomical observations, compounded into sophisticated mathematical frameworks, and centres of cultural authority emerged in locations we can no longer excavate, because the ocean is sitting on top of them. The King List's pre-flood cities, Eridubad, Tibira, Larak, Sipha, Shurupak, may not be the original centres of this forgotten epoch. They may be the inland successors, the places where displaced populations resettled as coastlines retreated, carrying with them the memory of older centres that the rising Gulf had already claimed. Eridu sits at what was once the edge of the Persian Gulf, exactly where refugees from a drowned coastal civilization would have arrived if they followed the rivers upstream. And what did the traditions preserved at Eridu say about its origins, that kingship descended from heaven, that it was the first city, that civilization began there, or rather began again there, in the language of restoration that pervades every layer of Sumerian self-understanding? The forgotten epoch was not a myth. It was a place many places now lying beneath water that rose too slowly for any single generation to perceive as catastrophe, but fast enough over the centuries to erase entire worlds. The people who lived through it did what people always do: when the ground shifts beneath them, they moved, they adapted, they carried what they could, and they remembered. They remembered in oral traditions passed from elder to initiate across generations. They remembered in architectural persistence, rebuilding temples on the same sacred ground, century after century. They remembered in mathematical systems sophisticated enough to encode cosmic time, and eventually when clay and reed stylus gave them a medium durable enough to outlast the next catastrophe. They remembered in writing, pressing into wet earth, the only chronological framework they had for organising a past so vast it required astronomical units to measure. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Not biography, not fantasy. A map drawn from memory of a world the ocean took, by people who refused to let it be forgotten entirely, even if all they could preserve was the skeleton of what was lost. The flesh is gone, the bones remain, and the bones are trying to tell us something if we can learn to read them without insisting they conform to a shape we already expect. We use the word catastrophe as though it means ending. But the Earth has a different vocabulary. In the language of geology, catastrophe is not a period at the end of a sentence. It is a comma, a breath between clauses, a pause in which the syntax of the landscape rearranges itself before the next phrase begins. Mountains rise and erode, oceans advance and withdraw, ice sheets expand across continents for 100,000 years, and then retreat in a geological whisper, leaving behind transformed coastlines and river systems that remember nothing of their former paths. The planet breathes on timescales we can barely perceive, and what we experience as apocalypse, the drowning of a coastline, the flooding of a valley, the collapse of everything a culture built across centuries, is from the Earth perspective an exhalation, not destruction. Adjustment. The Sumerian King List with its single devastating line. Then the flood swept over captures this breath, and everything that follows in the text is what happens when the Earth inhales again. The reset at the end of the last ice age was not a single event. It was a process spanning roughly 14,000 years from approximately 20,000 to 6,000 years ago, during which global temperatures rose, ice sheets collapsed, and the water they had imprisoned returned to the oceans in volumes almost impossible to comprehend. 120 metres of sea level rise, enough water to redraw the coastline of every continent, to flood millions of square kilometres of inhabited land, to erase the ground level evidence of whatever cultures had developed on those lowland plains and coastal shelves. During the tens of thousands of years the ice held the water back. But the process was not smooth. It came in pulses, sudden violent releases when glacial dams failed, or ice sheets broke apart faster than the gradual warming trend would predict. Meltwater pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago raised sea levels by approximately 20 metres in less than 500 years. Meltwater pulse 1B around 11,300 years ago added another surge. These were not gentle transitions. For the communities living on coastlines that had been stable for generations, these pulses would have been experienced as the world-ending waters rising visibly within a single lifetime, familiar landscapes vanishing beneath waves that never receded, the slow-motion drowning of everything that constituted home. And yet life continued. This is the part we forget when we fixate on catastrophe. The reset is not the end of the story. It is the hinge. The Ice Age ended, coastlines drowned, cultures were displaced, and then something remarkable happened. Within a few thousand years of the most dramatic meltwater pulses, the archaeological record shows an explosion of cultural complexity that has never been adequately explained by the conventional narrative of gradual development. Göbekli Tepe appears around 11,000 years ago, monumental stone architecture built by supposed hunter-gatherers who shouldn't have had the organisational capacity or the astronomical knowledge to construct it. Agriculture emerges independently in multiple locations around the world within a surprisingly narrow time window, as though the idea or the necessity crystallised simultaneously across cultures that had no contact with one another. Settled communities appear, pottery traditions develop, trade networks form across hundreds of kilometres, and in southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys would have received wave after wave of refugees displaced by the Persian Gulfs, northward advance, the foundations of what would become Sumerian civilization begin to take shape in the mud. The conventional explanation treats this post-catastrophe fluorescence as spontaneous generation human ingenuity finally reaching a tipping point after tens of thousands of years of slow cognitive development. But there is another way to read the evidence, one that the King List itself suggests. What if the explosion of complexity after the Ice Age was not invention but reconstruction? What if the people building Göbekli Tepe were not primitive geniuses stumbling onto architecture for the first time, but inheritors of traditions developed over millennia on now submerged coastlines, encoding their most important knowledge in stone because they had learned the hard way that everything else could be washed away? What if the agricultural revolution was not a sudden bright idea, but the re-establishment of practices that had been disrupted by displacement, adapted to new environments, by people who already understood the principles, but needed time to apply them to unfamiliar terrain? The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood their emergence in exactly these terms. They spoke of restoration, not invention. They described kingship descending from heaven not once but twice, this second descent explicitly following the flood, as though the cosmic order itself had been interrupted and needed to be re-established. Their scribes preserved the King List not as a record of continuous progress but as a record of discontinuity, a document that honestly acknowledges catastrophic rupture while insisting on continuity of tradition across that rupture. The reset in this reading is not the death of a civilization, it is its metamorphosis. Knowledge doesn't vanish simply because the cities that housed it are underwater. It travels in the minds of survivors, in the hands of craftspeople who carry their skills to new settlements, in the voices of priests and elders who recite the old stories to children born in exile. It degrades, certainly oral transmission loses fidelity with each generation. Technical knowledge simplifies when the infrastructure that supported it no longer exists. Astronomical observations become mythologized as the mathematical frameworks underlying them are forgotten. But the core persists. The structure survives even when the details blur, and when conditions stabilize, when sea levels stop rising, when new agricultural systems take hold, when population density reaches the threshold necessary to support specialized labor and monumental construction, that preserved knowledge finds expression again. Not identical to what came before, changed by the passage through catastrophe, the way sediment is changed by the passage through water, but recognizable, continuous, connected. The flood layers in Mesopotamian cities are not just evidence of destruction, they are boundaries between phases, the geological equivalent of a held breath between one movement of a symphony and the next. Below the silt one world, above it another, different in detail, but linked by the thread of transmitted knowledge that somehow survived the waters. The King List's single line about the flood does not mourn. It does not dramatize. It simply marks the transition with the calm precision of a scribe who understood that catastrophe, however devastating to those who lived through it, was not the end of the human story, but a punctuation mark within it. The earth exhaled, the waters rose, the coastlines drowned, and then the earth inhaled again, and the survivors rebuilt, carrying forward whatever they could salvage from the silence fragments of chronology, astronomical mathematics, the names of ancient cities, and the unshakable conviction that what they were building was not new. It was a restoration of what the waters had taken, a second descent of kingship from heaven. The same story resumed after a pause so vast it could only be measured in the language of stars. The past does not stay where we put it. We imagine history as something behind us, sealed in amber, separated from the present by the clean boundary of elapsed time. But that is not how inheritance works. The past leaks forward. It saturates the present in ways so pervasive we mistake its influence for nature, for instinct, for the way things have always been. Every time you glance at a clock and read 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, you are hearing an echo of Sumerian mathematics, base 60, thinking so deeply embedded in how we measure existence that we never pause to ask why 60 and not 10, why this particular number and not another. Every time you divide a circle into 360 degrees, you're using a Mesopotamian inheritance so ancient that its origins predate the civilization that formalized it. These are not trivial survivals. They are the fingerprints of a vanished world pressed into the structure of our daily experience, echoes so familiar we have forgotten they are echoes at all. The Sumerian King List suggests that this is precisely how deep time operates, not through preservation of complete records, but through the persistence of fragments, mathematical systems, architectural habits, mythological structures that survive catastrophe, by embedding themselves in the practices of whoever comes after. The echo does not reproduce the original sound. It reproduces its shape, its rhythm, its fundamental frequency, while the specific content, the words, the context, the full meaning degrades with each reflection off the walls of intervening centuries. What reaches us is not the message, but the pattern of the message, not the knowledge, but the architecture of the knowledge recognizable enough to provoke the unsettling feeling that we have heard this before, without being able to say exactly where or when. This is how the forgotten epoch survives in the modern world, not as explicit memory, but as structural inheritance, the way a child carries a grandparent's bone structure without carrying their memories, the way a river follows a course carved by glacial meltwater 10,000 years ago without knowing anything about ice. Consider the echoes that reverberate through sacred architecture. The Sumerian temple, the ziggurat, that stepped pyramid rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain, was not merely a building. It was a cosmological statement, an axis connecting earth to heaven, a physical manifestation of the belief that certain places served as conduits between human and divine realms. The same architectural principle appears in Egyptian pyramids, in Mesoamerican step pyramids, in Hindu temple towers, in Buddhist stupas, structures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of independent development, yet sharing the same fundamental geometry, the same vertical aspiration, the same conviction that height and alignment matter, that sacred architecture must reach upward and must be oriented to celestial events. The conventional explanation attributes this convergence to universal human psychology. We all look up at the sky. We all feel the impulse to build toward it. We all independently arrive at the pyramid as the most stable form for monumental construction, and perhaps that explanation is sufficient. But the King List whispers another possibility, that these architectural echoes carry the faint signal of a shared inheritance, a common understanding of sacred geometry that predated the divergence of civilizations and survived the catastrophes that separated them, persisting not in texts but in the hands of builders who knew how to orient a temple to the stars, even if they could no longer explain the full cosmological framework that originally demanded such orientation. The echo sounds in language too, though here it is hardest to trace and easiest to dismiss. Sumerian stands alone as a linguistic isolate, connected to no known language family, but certain Sumerian words and concepts penetrated far beyond Mesopotamia through the Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian cultures that inherited Sumerian learning. The word alcohol traces back through Arabic to an originally Mesopotamian chemical tradition. Mathematical terminology, astronomical vocabulary, legal concepts, threads of Sumerian thought, woven into the fabric of subsequent civilizations so thoroughly that extracting them would unravel the entire cloth. And beyond these traceable borrowings, there are deeper resonances that scholars have noted without being able to fully explain, Structural similarities between Sumerian grammar and certain language families of South Asia, lexical parallels between Sumerian and Dravidian languages that some linguists find suggestive, even if the evidence falls short of proof. These might be coincidences. They might be the last fading echoes of contact or common origin, so ancient that the linguistic evidence has degraded beyond the threshold of scholarly certainty. The echo grows faint, but it does not entirely disappear. Perhaps the most profound echo is the one that sounds in our bones, not metaphorically, but genetically. The populations that survived the Ice Age's end, that weathered the flooding of coastlines and the displacement of entire communities, carried their experience forward in the only medium that truly endures across deep time: DNA. Genetic studies of modern populations in the Fertile Crescent South Asia and Southeast Asia reveal migration patterns consistent with exactly the kind of catastrophic displacement. The King List's flood narrative implies movements from coastal regions to inland highlands, genetic bottlenecks suggesting dramatic population reductions, followed by expansion founder effects indicating that small groups of survivors established the populations from which later civilizations emerged. We carry the forgotten epoch in our cells. The trauma of the reset is written not just in flood layers and mythological texts, but in the statistical distribution of alleles across modern human populations, a biological echo of catastrophes experienced by ancestors so remote we have no names for them, only the silent testimony of inherited genetic patterns shaped by events that happened 10,000 years before anyone thought to press a reed into wet clay. The echoes converge, mathematical systems encoding base 60 thinking in our clocks and compasses, architectural principles aligning sacred structures to celestial events across every continent, linguistic fragments connecting cultures that history insists developed independently, genetic signatures of ancient displacement and survival written into the chromosomes of people who have never heard of Sumer and would not recognize a cuneiform tablet if they held one. The Sumerian King List is itself an echo, a textual reverberation of a chronological tradition older than the civilization that wrote it down, preserving the shape of a memory whose full content had already faded by the time the first scribe pressed stylus to clay. We live surrounded by these echoes, immersed in them so completely that we perceive them not as signals from a vanished world, but as the natural background hum of existence. But once you learn to listen, once you recognize the base 60 mathematics in your wristwatch, the astronomical alignments in ancient foundations, the flood narratives repeated across every inhabited continent, the hum resolves into something coherent, not a complete message, not a clear transmission, but a rhythm, ancient, persistent, patient, the heartbeat of something that drowned long ago, but whose pulse still moves through everything we are and everything we build. The echo is not fading, we are only now learning to hear it. There is a moment when you have been staring at scattered data long enough, when the individual points stop being individual, and a shape emerges not imposed by the observer, but revealed the way a constellation becomes visible only when you stop focusing on single stars and let your eyes relax into the spaces between them. The Sumerian King List has been pulling us toward this moment since we first traced those wedge-shaped marks in the silence of a museum hall. We have examined the evidence grain by grain, we have followed the anomalies into cracks that widened beneath our attention. We have listened to the silence of pre-literate millennia, and tried to reconstruct the forgotten epoch that silence conceals. We have watched the reset reshape the world and track the echoes of what survived into the architecture and mathematics and genetics of the present. Now, standing far enough back to see the full spread of what we've gathered, the pattern declares itself. And it is not a line, it is a circle. Every ancient civilization that left a record sophisticated enough to encode a cosmological framework arrived independently at the same conclusion that time is cyclical, that ages rise and fall in repeating sequences, that catastrophe is not an aberration, but a structural feature of existence, as regular and as necessary as the turning of seasons or the phases of the moon. The Sumerians encoded this understanding in a king list that divides time into cosmic epochs, measured by astronomical units, interrupted by flood resumed at diminished scale. The Egyptians recorded it in the Turin Papyrus, which begins with gods ruling for thousands of years, before transitioning through demigods to human pharaohs, the same descending arc from divine to mortal, from vast to compressed, from cosmic to political. Hindu cosmology formalized it most explicitly in the system of yugas, 4 ages of progressively shorter duration and diminishing virtue, cycling endlessly through creation, preservation, destruction and renewal, each cycle spanning millions of years, calculated in the same base 60 mathematics that structure the Sumerian King List. Greek tradition compressed it into Hesiod's 5 ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, heroic, iron, each representing a decline from an earlier perfection, each ending in destruction, the entire sequence implying repetition, even if Hesiod himself stood too close to the pattern to see its full shape. And across the Atlantic, Aztec and Maya cosmology recorded multiple suns or world ages, each lasting thousands of years, each ending in elemental catastrophe jaguars, hurricanes, fire, flood, with humanity diminished and rebuilt after every reset. The conventional, scholarly response to this global convergence is that it reflects universal features of human psychology rather than shared historical memory. Humans naturally idealize the past. Humans naturally fear catastrophe. Humans naturally organize experience into narrative patterns that impose meaning on the randomness of events. The cyclical model in this view is not a discovery about the nature of time, but a projection of human cognitive architecture onto the blank canvas of deep history. We see cycles because our minds are wired to see cycles, not because cycles exist. And this explanation has considerable force. Pattern recognition is indeed one of the brain's most fundamental operations, and the tendency to find patterns where none exist. Pareidolia, apophenia is well documented. But there is a problem with dismissing the global pattern as purely psychological, and the problem is mathematical. The numbers are too precise and too consistent across traditions that had no plausible mechanism for direct transmission. The Sumerian Sar 3600 appears as the fundamental unit in both Mesopotamian and Hindu cosmic chronologies. The Hindu Yuga cycle's base number 432,000 is exactly 120 Sar. The total duration of all 4 Yugas, 4,320,000 years, is 1,200 Sar. These are not vague resonances or approximate similarities that might arise from independent cultures, coincidentally choosing large round numbers. They are precise mathematical relationships built on the same base, 60 framework, and they encode the same structural principle cosmic time divided into descending epochs of diminishing duration, separated by catastrophic transitions. If 2 unconnected cultures independently developed cyclical cosmologies, we would expect their numbers to differ as randomly as their languages differ. We would not expect them to share a mathematical architecture so specific that one tradition's fundamental unit can be expressed as an exact multiple of the others. The pattern is not just thematic, it is computational. And computational patterns do not arise from shared psychology. They arise from shared mathematics, which implies either direct transmission between traditions or inheritance from a common source that predated their divergence. This is what the King List has been pointing toward all along. Not the specific claim that 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. That is the surface, the encoded summary, the compressed notation. What it points toward is the deeper framework, the understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, of catastrophe, as periodic rather than singular of human civilization, as a recurring phenomenon rather than a unique and unprecedented achievement. The pattern says that what we call the beginning of history, the emergence of writing, cities, agriculture and organized religion, around 3500 BC, is not a beginning at all. It is a resumption, the latest iteration of a cycle that has turned before and will turn again, leaving behind whatever fragments the survivors managed to carry through the flood into the next phase. We find this idea uncomfortable because it contradicts the narrative we prefer, the story of steady upward progress from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorance to knowledge, from superstition to science. That narrative makes us the culmination of everything that came before the apex of a long developmental arc, the most advanced version of humanity that has ever existed. The cyclical pattern suggests something less flattering. It suggests we are not the peak, but merely the current phase, no more permanent than the phases that preceded us, no more immune to the resets that ended them. The Earth's geological record supports the cyclical reading with quiet, implacable authority. Ice ages come and go in roughly 100,000-year cycles, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. The Milankovitch cycles that astronomers can calculate with the same mathematical precision the Sumerians brought to their celestial observations. Within those larger cycles, smaller oscillations produce periods of warming and cooling, sea level rise and fall, environmental stability and disruption, each capable of transforming the conditions under which human cultures develop. We are currently living in an interglacial period, a warm phase between ice ages, and the geological record tells us unambiguously that this warmth is temporary. The ice will return, the cycle will turn, and whatever we have built during this warm interval will face the same test that every previous civilization faced when the climate shifted beneath its foundations. The King List does not predict this. It does not need to. It simply records the pattern with the calm precision of scribes who understood that they were living inside a cycle, not at the end of a line. The pattern is not a theory. It is an observation made independently by cultures on every inhabited continent, encoded in mathematical frameworks, too precise to be coincidental, confirmed by geological evidence, too consistent to be denied. Time is not a straight road leading from primitive past to sophisticated future. It is a wheel, and we are riding it just as every civilization before us rode it toward a horizon that curves back to where it began. The Earth does not destroy without announcement. This is one of the oldest observations encoded in the geological record and one of the most consistently ignored by the civilizations that build upon its surface. Before every major shift, before ice sheets advance, before coastlines drown, before river systems rearrange themselves into configurations that render existing agricultural practices useless. There are signals, subtle at first, easily dismissed as anomaly or natural variation, but persistent, accumulating, building toward a threshold beyond which the system reorganizes itself into a new state, and everything adapted to the old state finds itself suddenly catastrophically obsolete. The Sumerian King List does not contain explicit warnings. It is not a prophetic text, but its structure cosmic epochs ending in flood, followed by diminished conditions and compressed timescales, encodes a truth that every geological discipline has since confirmed. The planet operates in cycles, and the transitions between cycles are not gentle. The warnings that preceded the end of the last ice age would have been legible to anyone paying attention to the natural world, with the kind of sustained multi-generational observation that ancient cultures practiced as a matter of survival. Sea levels did not rise overnight. They rose incrementally year after year, decade after decade, each generation. Noticing that the shoreline had crept slightly closer, that the fishing grounds had shifted, that the freshwater springs near the coast had turned brackish, that the low-lying fields where their grandparents had planted crops were now salt marsh. These changes would have been slow enough to accommodate through gradual adaptation, moving settlements slightly inland, adjusting agricultural practices, modifying trade routes. But they would also have been relentless and unidirectional, a one-way transformation that no amount of adaptation could ultimately outpace. The communities living on the Persian Gulf's coastal plains, the inhabitants of Doggerland, the populations of Sunderland, all would have experienced this creeping displacement for centuries before the final inundations that erased their landscapes entirely. They had warnings. The warnings simply operated on timescales that made each individual generation's experience seem manageable, even as the cumulative trajectory pointed toward total loss. And then there were the sudden events, the meltwater pulses that punctuated the gradual rise with catastrophic accelerations, when glacial ice dams failed, releasing enormous lakes of accumulated meltwater into river systems and oceans within months or years. The resulting floods would have been unlike anything in living memory. Walls of water advancing across low-lying plains, coastlines jumping inland by kilometers in a single season, communities that had adapted to gradual change suddenly confronting change so rapid it exceeded any capacity for response. These events left their signatures in ocean sediment cores as sudden spikes in freshwater indicators, and they left their signatures in human memory as flood narratives Stories of waters rising without warning, of entire worlds submerged, of survivors who escaped by boat or by fleeing to high ground, and who carried forward the traumatic memory of having watched everything they knew disappear beneath the surface of an indifferent sea. The King List's single line. Then the flood swept over compresses what may have been centuries of escalating environmental crisis into a single chronological marker, the way a scar compresses the entire narrative of a wound into a line of raised tissue that tells you something happened here without telling you how long the bleeding lasted. What makes the King List's implicit warning irrelevant beyond historical curiosity is the recognition that the conditions it describes are not unique to the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. The Earth's climate system has always operated through cycles of stability and disruption, and the interglacial period we currently inhabit, the warm, relatively stable interval that has persisted for roughly 11,000 years, and during which every civilization we know of has developed, is not a permanent state. It is a phase. Ice core records from Greenland and Antarctica show that previous interglacials lasted between 10 and 30,000 years before the climate system shifted back toward glaciation, and our current interglacial is already 11,000 years old. The geological record does not guarantee that the next disruption will take the same form as the last one. Sea level rise from ice melt is only one of many mechanisms through which the planet resets its surface conditions, but it guarantees with absolute certainty that disruption will come. The only questions are when, how fast, and whether the civilizations existing at the time will have preserved enough knowledge and maintained enough flexibility to survive the transition. The ancient cultures that encoded cyclical time in their cosmologies understood this with a clarity that modern civilization, despite its vastly superior scientific instrumentation, has largely failed to internalize. The Hindu Yuga system does not treat cosmic destruction as a one-time event to be mourned. It treats it as a recurring feature of existence to be anticipated, prepared for, and survived through the preservation of essential knowledge. The Mesoamerican sun cycles do not describe a single apocalypse. They describe a series of world ages, each ending in destruction, each followed by renewal, with the explicit understanding that the current age will end the same way. The Sumerian King List does not dramatize the flood because it does not regard the flood as exceptional. It regards it as a boundary marker between phases of a cycle that the scribes expected would continue turning. These were not pessimistic civilizations wallowing in fatalism. They were realistic civilizations that had incorporated the observable evidence of cyclical catastrophe into their fundamental understanding of how time works, and they structured their knowledge preservation systems accordingly, encoding essential information in durable media, maintaining oral traditions with ritual precision, building monuments aligned to celestial events that would remain legible, even if the cultures that built them did not survive. The warning encoded in the King List is not about a specific future event. It is about the nature of the system we inhabit. The Earth breathes in cycles. Coastlines advance and retreat. Ice accumulates and melts. River systems build and destroy. And human civilizations, which depend on environmental stability for agriculture, trade, and urban life, rise during stable phases and face existential threat during transitions. The King List's pre-flood epochs, measured in astronomical units, represent stable phases, long periods during which cultural complexity could accumulate and deepen. The flood represents the transition, the moment when accumulated stability gives way to rapid reorganization, and everything built during the stable phase is tested against the new conditions. The post-flood dynasties, with their shrinking reign lengths and recognizable human timescales, represent the rebuilding, the long, slow process of reassembling knowledge and re-establishing complexity after catastrophic disruption. This is not ancient mythology. It is the structure of the Earth's climate history described in the only language available to people who had observed it, survived it, and understood with bone-deep certainty that it would happen again. The Earth is always warning. The only question is whether we are listening with the same attention the ancient astronomers brought to the movement of stars, patient, precise, measured in units large enough to capture the full scope of what the planet is trying to say. The signals are not hidden, they are simply slow, and we have built a civilization that has forgotten how to read anything that moves slower than a news cycle. The Sumerians looked up and saw your order, not the cold mechanical order of a clockwork universe that metaphor belongs to a much later age, but a living order, a conversation between celestial bodies conducted in mathematics so precise that its grammar could be learned by anyone patient enough to watch the sky for long enough. They tracked Venus through its 8-year synodic cycle, noting with meticulous care the dates of its appearance as morning star and evening star, its periods of invisibility, the exact points on the horizon where it rose and set across the seasons. They followed Jupiter's stately 12-year circuit through the constellations. They calculated lunar months and solar years, and discovered the slight discrepancy between them that accumulates over centuries into a drift significant enough to demand correction. They measured the precession of the equinoxes, that imperceptibly slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. And they understood that this wobble meant the stars themselves were moving not randomly but in a vast predictable pattern that dwarfed every other cycle they had observed. The sky was not decoration. It was a calendar written in light, and the Sumerians read it with the same disciplined attention their scribes brought to cuneiform tablets. Because to them the sky and the tablet were the same kind of document records of order, expressions of the fundamental laws they called me, the divine principles governing everything, from the movements of planets to the legitimacy of kings. This connection between sky and earth was not metaphorical. It was structural, built into the mathematical foundations of Sumerian civilization so deeply that separating celestial observation from terrestrial organization would have been as incomprehensible to them as separating grammar from language. The base 60 number system they used for everything, commerce construction, timekeeping astronomy, was itself a product of celestial observation, chosen because 60 is divisible by so many factors that it accommodates the awkward relationships between different astronomical cycles more elegantly than any other base. 12 months in a year, 30 days in a month, 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. These are not arbitrary conventions. They are the residue of a civilization that organized all of earthly existence according to patterns observed in the heavens, and they persist in our daily lives with such quiet ubiquity that we have ceased to notice we are still living inside a Sumerian astronomical framework every time we read a clock or measure an angle or divide a circle. The King List's pre-flood reign lengths those enormous numbers expressed in multiples of the seah, the astronomical unit, equal to 3,600, become fully intelligible only within this framework. The scribes who recorded Alulim's reign as 28,800 years 8 Sar were not making a biographical claim about an individual human being. They were placing an epoch within a celestial coordinate system, marking a phase of earthly history according to the astronomical cycles that governed it, the way we might date a geological period by its position within the Milankovitch cycles that drive Ice Age periodicity. To separate the King List's chronology from its astronomical context is to misread it as fundamentally as you would misread a star chart by interpreting it as a landscape painting. The document is not about kings. It is about the relationship between celestial time and terrestrial time, between the vast, slow cycles observable in the heavens and the shorter, faster cycles experienced on Earth, and the kings are labels for the points where those two temporal scales intersect. This cosmological integration of sky and earth extended far beyond Mesopotamia, suggesting either widespread transmission or independent discovery of the same fundamental insight that earthly conditions are governed by celestial mechanics. Egyptian temple architecture aligned to stellar events with precision that modern surveying equipment confirms to within fractions of a degree. The Great Pyramid's shafts point to specific stars as they appeared in the sky, around 2500 BC, and the entire Giza complex may encode the pattern of Orion's belt, in its spatial arrangement a claim debated by scholars, but supported by alignments too precise to be easily attributed to coincidence. Hindu astronomical texts, the Siddhantas and the Surya Siddhanta, contain calculations of planetary periods and precessional cycles that demonstrate mathematical sophistication comparable to Mesopotamian astronomy, expressed in the same base 60 numerical language, and embedded within the same cosmological framework of vast cyclical ages governed by celestial mechanics. Mesoamerican cultures tracked Venus with obsessive precision, organized their calendars around astronomical cycles, and built ceremonial centers aligned to solstices, equinoxes, and specific stellar risings with an accuracy that implies centuries of sustained observation and mathematical refinement. The convergence is not merely that ancient cultures observe the sky, every human society has done that, but that they organize terrestrial time, political authority, sacred architecture, and cosmological understanding according to celestial patterns, treating the relationship between sky and earth as the fundamental ordering principle of existence. The King List participates in this tradition at its deepest level. Its pre-flood chronology is not a failed attempt at human biography, it is a successful attempt at cosmological cartography, a map of how celestial cycles structured earthly epochs, how astronomical time related to political time, how the vast slow rhythms of the heavens manifested in the rise and fall of civilizations on the ground below. The flood in this context acquires additional meaning. It is not merely a historical catastrophe or a geological event. It is a cosmological boundary, the point at which one celestial configuration gave way to another one set of governing astronomical relationships, yielded to a new set, and the earthly conditions structured by the old configuration were swept away to make room for the conditions demanded by the new one. Kingship descending from heaven is not poetic fancy. It is a precise cosmological statement. Authority and order on earth derive from and are structured by patterns in the heavens, and when those heavenly patterns shift, earthly order must be re-established in accordance with the new celestial arrangement. We have lost this integration. Modern civilization treats astronomy and governance as entirely separate domains, the sky as an object of scientific curiosity, unrelated to political or social organization, celestial mechanics as a branch of physics, with no bearing on how we structure time authority or cultural meaning. But we still measure time in Sumerian units. We still divide space in Sumerian degrees. We still organize our calendar around astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar phases, even if we no longer consciously connect those events to the social and political structures built upon them. The connection between sky and earth that the Sumerians treated as the foundation of all order has not been disproven, it has been forgotten. And the King List, with its astronomical reign lengths, and its celestial chronology, and its insistence that kingship descended from heaven, sits in its museum case like a reminder that there was once a civilization sophisticated enough to read both sky and earth as a single text written in the same mathematical language expressing the same cyclical truths. We divided what they unified. We separated what they understood as inseparable. And in doing so, we lost the ability to read the very document they left behind, a map of time drawn in the language of stars addressed to an audience that understood that the ground beneath their feet and the light above their heads were pages in the same ancient book, governed by the same rhythms, measured in the same patient units of 60. You have felt it before, the strange gravity of a place you have never visited, the inexplicable familiarity of a melody you cannot remember learning, the unsettling sense when standing in certain ruins or beneath certain skies that you are not discovering something new but returning to something old. This feeling has a name in almost every language, and in almost every culture it is treated not as illusion but as signal, a message from a deeper layer of experience breaking through the surface of ordinary awareness to remind you that the present moment is not as unprecedented as it appears. The Greeks called it anamnesis, the remembering of what the soul already knows. The Hindus embedded it in the doctrine of samsara, the wheel of return, that carries consciousness through cycle after cycle of existence. The Sumerians expressed it in the phrase that opens their King List. After the kingship descended from heaven, a formulation that implies not origination but arrival, not creation but return, as though authority and order were not invented on earth, but periodically delivered to it from a source that operates on longer timescales than any single civilization can witness. The King List structure is itself a document of return. Kingship descends from heaven, establishes itself in Eridu, moves through a sequence of cities, across vast epochs is interrupted by catastrophic flood, and then descends from heaven again, the same cosmic principle re-entering the terrestrial sphere after a period of absence, re-establishing order in a new location under new conditions, but according to the same fundamental template. This is not linear history. It is not even cyclical history, in the simple sense of events repeating identically. It is something more nuanced, a spiral in which the same essential pattern recurs but at a different position, the way a musical theme returns in a later movement of a symphony, transposed to a new key, recognizably the same theme but altered by everything that has intervened since its first statement. The post-flood world is not a copy of the pre-flood world. It is its echo, its descendant, its diminished but persistent continuation, carrying the same structural DNA, but expressed in compressed form, the way a seed carries the blueprint of a tree that has already fallen. We are living in one of these returns right now, though we rarely recognize it as such. The civilization that emerged in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, with its sudden sophistication, its fully formed writing, its astronomical mathematics, its insistence on restoration rather than invention, was itself a return, a re-emergence of cultural complexity after the catastrophic disruptions that ended the Ice Age and drowned the coastlines where earlier complexity had developed, and our own civilization, which traces its intellectual ancestry through Greece and Rome back to Mesopotamia, is a further iteration of the same pattern knowledge lost and partially recovered complexity disrupted, and gradually rebuilt, the same fundamental questions about time order and existence addressed again and again by successive cultures that sense they are working with inherited materials even when they cannot identify the source of the inheritance. The questions we ask today about the King List, well, what do these numbers mean? What was the flood? What came before? Are themselves returns? The same questions that Sumerian scribes asked when they compiled the list from fragmentary sources, they could no longer fully interpret the same questions that Babylonian scholars asked when they copied and preserved Sumerian texts in a language that was already dead, the same questions that every civilization asks when it encounters the residue of something older and more complete than itself. The return manifests in concrete ways that resist dismissal as mystical thinking. When archaeologists excavated Eridu's temple mound and found 18 successive shrines built one atop another over 8,000 years, they were documenting a physical return, generation after generation, coming back to the same sacred ground, rebuilding on the same foundation, maintaining connection to the same origin point through every climate shift and cultural transformation and catastrophic flood that intervened. That persistence is not superstition. It is information storage, the most durable form of memory available to pre-literate societies, encoding in architecture what could not yet be encoded in text, declaring through the physical act of rebuilding that this place matters, that what began here must not be abandoned, that the thread connecting present to past must be maintained even when the past can no longer be fully articulated. And when Sumerian kings inscribed their temple restorations with phrases like, "I rebuilt what had been founded in ancient days and I restored it to its place," they were participating in the same pattern of return, consciously, deliberately positioning themselves as links in a chain of transmission that stretched back beyond their own comprehension into epochs they could only measure in the language of stars. The return is not comfortable. It carries with it the weight of everything that was lost in the intervals between iterations, the knowledge that degraded during transmission, the context that evaporated when the cultures maintaining them were displaced, the full meaning of astronomical numbers that became opaque as the framework supporting their interpretation disappeared. Each return is diminished relative to what came before, not because the people doing the returning are less capable, but because catastrophe is an imperfect filter that preserves structure while stripping content the way a flood deposits sediment in layers that record the fact of the flood's occurrence, without preserving any of the organic life the waters carried. The King List itself is evidence of this diminishment, a document that preserves the chronological architecture of a much longer and more detailed record while losing the narrative substance that would make the architecture fully comprehensible. We can see the framework. We cannot read the story it once contained, and yet the framework persists, and its persistence is itself a form of return. The same impulse to organize deep time, to maintain chronological continuity across catastrophic rupture, to insist that something came before, and that what came before matters expressing itself through Sumerian scribes, through Babylonian copyists, through modern archaeologists, through anyone who has ever looked at the King List and felt the vertiginous pull of recognition that says this document is trying to tell me something I almost already know. The wheel turns, the pattern recurs. Kingship descends from heaven, establishes itself in cities that feel permanent, endures for what seems like an eternity measured in cosmic units, and then the flood sweeps over, and the cycle resets, and kingship descends again, diminished but unbroken, carrying forward whatever survived the waters into a new world that will mistake itself for the first world, until it too encounters the evidence of what came before, and feels the ancient vertigo of return. We are in that moment now. The King List is in our hands. The numbers stare back at us from baked clay patient, as geology precise as starlight, waiting for us to recognize that the question we're asking, what does this document mean, is not a new question at all. It is the oldest question, and the fact that we are asking it is itself the answer. The return is not something that happens to us, it is something we are. The wheel turns and we turn with it, and the clay tablet in the museum case holds its silence, the way a seed holds a forest complete, compressed, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to unfold once more into something that remembers what it always was. And so, we arrive here not at an answer but at a stillness, the kind of stillness that follows a long journey through unfamiliar terrain, when you stop walking not because you have reached a destination, but because you have come far enough to see where you are, and where you are turns out to be different from where you thought you were going. We began this journey in the dust of southern Iraq, beneath a sky heavy with stars that Sumerian astronomers mapped in base 60 mathematics 5,000 years ago. We traced wedge-shaped marks on a clay tablet that claimed 8 kings, ruled 5 cities for 241,200 years, before a flood swept everything away. We followed those marks down through layers of sediment and silence, through flood strata and pre-literate architecture, through astronomical cycles and global parallels, through the drowned coastlines of a forgotten epoch and the patient echoes that survived the drowning. And now, having travelled all that distance, we find ourselves not at the edge of certainty, but at the threshold of a quieter, more spacious kind of not knowing, the kind that feels less like ignorance and more like reverence. The kind that understands how much has been lost and does not demand that the loss be filled with premature conclusions. The Sumerian King List will not give us proof of a lost civilization. It will not confirm Atlantis or validate ancient astronaut theories, or resolve the question of whether human complexity predates the conventional timeline by centuries or millennia. What it gives us instead is permission to hold the question open, to sit with uncertainty, the way the tablet itself sits in its museum case quietly, patiently, without insisting on resolution. Permission to acknowledge that our historical timeline, however carefully constructed from archaeological evidence and textual analysis, accounts for only a thin layer of human experience, the topmost stratum of a much deeper deposit, the visible portion of an iceberg, whose submerged mass we can sense, but cannot measure. The 5,000 years of written history we can read represent less than 2% of the time Homo sapiens has existed as a species. Everything before that, every culture, every language, every astronomical observation, every act of love or engineering or worship conducted by our ancestors during the other 98% of human existence is silence. Not because it didn't happen, but because it happened in media that time, consumed on coastlines, that oceans swallowed in traditions that catastrophe interrupted before they could be pressed into something as durable as clay. There is peace in accepting this, not the false peace of pretending we know more than we do, and not the anxious peace of demanding that every mystery be solved before we can rest, but the genuine peace that comes from recognizing our place within a story, so much larger than ourselves that the appropriate response is not mastery, but wonder. The Sumerian scribes understood this. They did not claim to fully comprehend the chronology they were preserving. They did not pretend the pre-flood epochs made sense in human terms. They simply recorded what they had inherited: astronomical numbers, city names, a flood that divided one world from another, with the same careful precision they brought to grain inventories and temple accounts, trusting that the act of preservation mattered even when the full meaning of what was being preserved had already begun to fade. They were guardians, not interpreters. And perhaps that is what we are called to be as well, not the generation that solves the King List, but the generation that keeps the question alive, that refuses to let the strangeness of this document be domesticated into comfortable categories of myth or propaganda, that maintains the space between knowing and not knowing where genuine inquiry can breathe. The reflection when it comes is not about the past at all. It is about the present, about the quality of attention we bring to the fragments that survive, about our willingness to be changed by what we encounter, in the archaeological silence, about the humility required to admit that a civilization capable of tracking Venus cycles and calculating processional epochs might have known things we have forgotten and organized knowledge in ways we have not yet learned to recognize. Every generation that has encountered the King List has projected its own assumptions onto those enigmatic numbers. 19th century scholars saw primitive mythology. 20th century scholars saw political propaganda. 21st century researchers are beginning to see encoded astronomical data. Each reading reveals as much about the readers as about the text, and the text endures, through all of them patient, as the clay it was written on, waiting for an audience capable of asking questions large enough to match the scale of what it contains. Perhaps that audience has not yet arrived. Perhaps we are still too close to our own assumptions, too embedded in our linear narrative of progress, too committed to the idea that we represent the pinnacle of human achievement, to read a document that suggests we might instead represent the latest recovery from the latest catastrophe in a series of cycles that extends far beyond our capacity to measure. But here in the quiet that follows a long night of listening, something shifts. The need to resolve the mystery loosens its grip. The compulsion to decide myth or history fiction or fact propaganda or archive softens into something more generous, a willingness to let the King List be what it has always been, a human artifact of extraordinary strangeness, carrying the compressed memory of epochs we cannot verify in a mathematical language. We are only beginning to relearn, preserved by scribes who believed their role was not to create, but to remember. And if their memory was imperfect, if the transmission degraded across the millennia, and the catastrophes that separated them from whatever they were trying to preserve, that imperfection does not diminish the achievement. It deepens it. Because the decision to preserve, to press stylus into wet clay, and record a chronology stretching back beyond comprehension, knowing that the full context was already slipping away, knowing that future readers might not understand doing it anyway, because the act of remembering matters even when the memory is incomplete. That decision is itself the most human thing the King List contains, more human than the numbers, more human than the king names, more human than the astronomical mathematics or the flood narrative or the 5 ancient cities, the choice to fight against, forgetting to insist that something came before, and that it mattered to trust that the act of recording is worthwhile, even in the face of inevitable loss. That is what the scribe's fingerprints in the clay are really saying. Not remember these kings, not believe these numbers, simply remember, and let the remembering be enough. Let it settle around you the way sediment settles, through still water, slowly, gently, each particle, finding its place in the accumulating layers of everything you have heard tonight. The tablet rests in its case. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient mathematics. The dust of Eridu drifts across a mound where 18 temples rose and fell on the same sacred ground. And you are here, breathing quietly in the dark part of the pattern now, another layer in the long deposit of human attention that has been accumulating around this small clay tablet for 4,000 years. That's enough. That is more than enough. More than. Let the stillness hold you. Let the questions remain open. Let the silence between the ancient lines carry whatever weight it needs to carry, without asking it to resolve into certainty. Sleep now, if sleep is what brought you here. The King List will keep its vigil through the night as it has kept it through millennia, holding its memory like a candle in a window, not bright enough to illuminate the whole of what was lost, but steady enough to remind anyone passing in the darkness that someone once thought it was worth the effort to keep the light alive. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The dust of Mesopotamia is settling behind us now. The clay tablet rests in its case. The stars continue their slow rotation overhead, measured in the same base 60 mathematics that a scribe pressed into wet earth 4,000 years ago, and the silence between those ancient wedge-shaped marks holds steady, neither demanding nor retreating, simply present the way stone is present, the way sediment is present, the way the weight of deep time is always present beneath whatever thin layer of noise we build on top of it. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. 14,000 words pass through you, like water passing through limestone, slowly, quietly dissolving what needed, dissolving, depositing what needed depositing, leaving traces in places you won't discover until much later in thoughts that surface weeks from now, without obvious origin, in moments of strange recognition, when something ancient feels briefly inexplicably familiar. The knowledge is not lost. It has simply settled deeper than conscious memory into the bedrock where the oldest things are kept. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. The Sumerian scribes who preserved the King List did not fully understand it either. They held the mystery with open hands, and that was enough. You can hold it the same way gently, without grasping, without needing resolution. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Let your body remember what your mind is ready to release, that you are part of the sediment now. Another layer in the long accumulation held by the same earth that holds the flood silt and the temple foundations and the fingerprints of forgotten scribes. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again, "Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch."